I've been sitting in this car for 20 minutes now, engine off, hands still gripping the steering wheel like it might anchor me to something solid. The leather is warm under my palms, absorbing the heat that seems to radiate from everywhere except inside my chest. Outside, the late afternoon sun cuts through the windshield at that particular angle that makes everything look like a memory before it's even finished happening. The radio is still playing softly. Some old song I used to skip whenever it came on, back when I thought I knew what I wanted to hear. Now it feels like the only sound that makes sense. The melody drifts through the car, mixing with the distant hum of traffic and the faint tick of the cooling engine. I should turn it off. I should get out. I should do a lot of things that feel impossible from where I'm sitting. The passenger seat holds a duffel bag that's traveled more miles than most people's cars. Canvas worn soft at the corners, zipper that sticks halfway and requires just the right pressure to close. Inside, folded between a week's worth of clothes that smell like hotel laundry and road trip coffee, are the things I can't seem to leave behind no matter how many times I tell myself I should. There's a hoodie that isn't mine. Navy blue with a faded logo from some marathon Grant ran 3 years ago. He left it in my apartment after one of his visits, draped over the back of my couch like he'd be returning for it the next morning. I washed it once, thinking I'd mail it back to him. Instead, I found myself pulling it on during those nights when my apartment felt too quiet and my own clothes felt like they belonged to someone I was still figuring out how to be. Next to it, a stick of deodorant, half used, the kind that costs too much and smells like the cologne section of department stores. Grant always bought expensive things for everyday use, a habit left over from the year he made more money than he knew what to do with. He forgot it on my bathroom counter 6 months ago. Such a small thing to keep. Such a small thing to make everything smell like the memory of him getting ready in the morning, humming under his breath while he thought no one was listening. But it's the photo strip that really undoes me every time I see it. For squares of black and white, the kind you get from those booths in shopping centers that teenagers use to document their fleeting romances. We were 23, maybe 24. Old enough to know better, young enough not to care. I can't even remember whose idea it was to duck into that booth during what was supposed to be a quick stop for coffee on a road trip to nowhere in particular. In the first frame, we're both looking at the camera, Grant's arm slung around my shoulders like it belonged there. By the second, we're laughing at something one of us said, our heads tilted toward each other in a way that suggests we shared a language no one else spoke. The third shows Grant looking at me instead of the camera, caught in a moment of unguarded affection that the lens captured before either of us realized it was happening. In the fourth, we're both dissolving into laughter, my hand pressed against his chest, as if I could feel the sound vibrating through his ribs. Looking at it now, I can almost hear that laughter again. The way it filled the tiny booth and spilled out into the mall corridor where other people walked past, carrying on with their ordinary Saturday afternoons while we sat in that cramped space acting like we had invented joy. Grant is the man in those pictures. Grant with his crooked smile and his terrible jokes and his way of making any place feel like home just by being in it. Grant who used to call at 2 a.m. when he couldn't sleep, not because he needed anything specific, just because my voice made the dark feel less overwhelming. Grant who taught me that love doesn't always announce itself with fireworks and sweeping gestures. Sometimes it's just the steady presence of someone who chooses you, again and again, without ever having to explain why. The last time I saw him, we were standing outside a bar neither of us should have gone to. It was the kind of place where the music was too loud and the drinks were too strong, and people went to forget things they weren't ready to remember yet. We hadn't planned to meet there. I was in town for work. He was there for reasons he didn't share, and somehow we found ourselves at the same sticky table, nursing beers that tasted like regret and talking around all the things we'd never learned how to say directly. The night had started easy enough. The familiar rhythm of our conversations, the way we could pick up threads from months ago, as if no time had passed at all. But something was different. A tension in the space between us that felt like a held breath, like standing at the edge of something neither of us was brave enough to name. When we finally left, the parking lot was nearly empty. Our cars were parked side by side, and for a moment we just stood there, keys in hand, neither of us making a move toward goodbye. The air was thick with summer heat and the kind of silence that begs to be filled with truth. That's when he said it. It's just easier with you. The words came out soft, almost lost under the distant sound of traffic and the hum of neon signs. But I heard them. I felt them settle into the space between my ribs where all my careful defenses lived. I opened my mouth to ask what he meant, to push past the careful boundaries we'd built around ourselves and demand the kind of honesty that might change everything. But before I could form the question, he was already turning away, already walking toward his car with the kind of determined stride that said the conversation was over before it had really begun. I stood there watching his taillights disappear into the night, those 4 words echoing in my head like a song I couldn't stop humming. It's just easier with you. Easier than what? Easier than pretending? Easier than the life he'd built with someone else? Easier than admitting that whatever existed between us had a name he wasn't ready to speak. That was 8 months ago. 8 months of silence punctuated only by the kind of polite holiday texts that feel like placeholders for all the conversations we're not having. 8 months of me carrying those words around like stones in my pockets, pulling them out at random moments to examine them in different light, hoping they might reveal some hidden meaning I'd missed the first 100 times. Now I'm back. Officially, I'm here for work. A freelance assignment that could have been done from anywhere, but somehow required me to be in this specific city, breathing this specific air, driving down streets that taste like memory and possibility in equal measure. That's the story I'll tell anyone who asks. That's the story I've been telling myself. But sitting here in this car, surrounded by the evidence of a connection I've never learned how to categorize, I know the real reason I came back. It has nothing to do with work and everything to do with those 4 words that have been living in my chest like a question I'm finally ready to ask. He never did explain what he meant, and I never stopped needing to know. The sun is getting lower now, painting everything in shades of gold and regret. Soon I'll have to make a decision. Turn the key, drive to my hotel, pretend this is just another city on another assignment. Or do what I really came here to do. Find Grant and ask the question that's been keeping me awake for 8 months. In the photo strip, we looked so young, so certain that whatever we had would always be enough, even if we never named it. But time has a way of making silence feel heavier, and some questions grow too large to carry alone. The radio is still playing. The same old love song that used to make me reach for the dial. Now I let it finish, let the final notes fade into the quiet hum of a car that's been waiting patiently for me to decide what comes next. I am 36 years old, and I have never lived anywhere long enough for the mail to catch up. This is not an accident. It's a carefully cultivated way of existing that keeps me just out of reach of the kinds of conversations that require you to stay still long enough to have them. My life fits into 2 suitcases and a laptop bag, and most days that feels like exactly the right amount of space for someone who has never learned how to answer the question of where home is. Freelance journalism was supposed to be temporary. A way to pay the bills while I figured out what I actually wanted to do with the English degree that cost more than my parents' first house. But temporary has a way of becoming permanent when you discover that movement feels safer than stillness. When you realize that being the guy who's always just passing through means no one expects you to explain the parts of yourself you haven't figured out how to share yet. I've never come out to my family. Not because they're the kind of people who would disown me or stage an intervention, but because coming out implies there's something definitive to announce, something clear and categorizable that fits into the neat boxes people prefer when they're trying to understand your life. The truth is messier than that. I exist in the gray spaces between definitions, in the quiet certainty that I love who I love without needing to defend it to Sunday dinner conversations or family reunions where everyone wants to know when I'm going to settle down and give them grandchildren to spoil. My mother still asks about girlfriends sometimes, the way mothers do when they're fishing for information they're not sure they want to have. I've learned to deflect with stories about work, about the places I've been and the articles I'm writing. She seems satisfied with the idea that I'm too busy building a career to worry about building a relationship. It's easier than explaining that the person who makes me feel most like myself isn't someone I can bring home for Christmas dinner. Grant has always been the exception to everything. The one constant in a life designed around constants being temporary. We met in college through the random cruelty of dormitory assignments. Roommates by accident, friends by choice, and something deeper than friendship by a process so gradual neither of us noticed it happening until it was already too late to pretend otherwise. He was studying business with the kind of focused determination that made other people assume He had his whole life planned out in spreadsheets. I was majoring in English and changing my mind about everything else on a weekly basis. On paper, we had nothing in common. In practice, we had everything that mattered. He laughed at my terrible jokes. I listened to his ambitious plans for the future. He taught me how to drive stick shift in the empty parking lot behind the library. I introduced him to books that had nothing to do with profit margins and everything to do with the way words could make you feel less alone in the world. Those 4 years felt like a preview of the life I might have chosen if I'd been braver. If I'd understood then what I was too afraid to name. We shared everything except the words for what we were sharing. Late nights talking until the sun came up. Road trips to nowhere that lasted for days. The kind of friendship that made other people jealous because they could see what we had even if we couldn't admit it to ourselves. After graduation, Grant did exactly what everyone expected him to do. He got the job, found the girl, bought the house, had the baby. The whole American dream unfolding in perfect sequence like a magazine spread about successful young families. From the outside, it looked like everything a person was supposed to want. From the inside, I couldn't help but wonder if he was as happy as he appeared to be. But even after his life became the kind of settled thing mine was designed to avoid, there was always space for me in it. Every few months, when whatever assignment I was working on brought me within driving distance, I would call. A couch was always offered. Dinners were made that stretched late into the evening while his wife worked night shifts at the hospital and his daughter slept upstairs. Long walks were taken through neighborhoods where every house looked like a promise someone had made and kept. During those visits, we would fall back into the easy rhythm of conversations that picked up exactly where they'd left off months before. He would tell me about the promotion he was chasing, the vacation they were planning, the way his daughter had started reading chapter books and asking questions about everything. I would tell him about the cities I'd been to, the stories I was working on, the restless feeling that kept me moving even when I wasn't sure where I was going. What I didn't tell him was how those visits felt like coming home to a place I'd never actually lived. How the guest room in his house was the closest thing I had to permanent address. How watching him exist in the life he'd built made me simultaneously proud of his happiness and hollow with longing for something I couldn't quite name. The arrangement worked for years. I would appear and disappear like a benevolent ghost, fitting into the spaces between his real life without disrupting the careful balance he'd created. His wife tolerated my visits with the kind of polite warmth reserved for old friends who know their place. His daughter treated me like a favorite uncle who brought stories from faraway places and always remembered to ask about the book she was reading. It was sustainable because it was contained, because we both understood the unspoken rules that kept our friendship from spilling over into territory that might require either of us to examine what we were really doing when we chose to keep choosing each other. Until last year, when something shifted, when the careful boundaries we'd maintained started to feel less like protection and more like prison walls. When the space between what we said and what we meant became too small to hold all the things we weren't saying. That's when everything changed. And that's when the silence began. The assignment comes through email on a Tuesday morning while I'm drinking coffee that tastes like it was brewed in a gas station 3 states ago. Post-pandemic suburban migration patterns in mid-sized American cities. Not my usual beat, which typically involves political scandals or environmental disasters. But freelancers don't have the luxury of being particular about subject matter when the rent is due. The editor wants 1,500 words about how remote work changed where people choose to live, complete with interviews and demographic data. Standard magazine fare that could be researched and written from anywhere with decent internet. But the focal city she's chosen is Grant City. The place where he bought his house and planted his roots and built the life that leaves no room for the kind of friendship we used to have. I stare at the email for 20 minutes before responding. Tell myself it's just a coincidence. Tell myself I can handle this professionally, that I've been in the same city as Grant before without it becoming complicated. Tell myself a lot of things that feel true until I start planning the trip and realize my hands are shaking while I book the hotel room. For 3 days, I debate whether to reach out. Draft texts that I delete before sending. Look up his number in my phone and let my thumb hover over the call button before losing my nerve and putting the phone away. The rational part of my brain insists this doesn't have to be complicated. I could do the assignment, file the story, and leave without him ever knowing I was there. The city is big enough. The chances of running into him are minimal. But the irrational part, the part that's been carrying around those 4 words like a stone in my shoe, knows I came here for more than demographic data and interview quotes. Knows I've been looking for an excuse to come back ever since that night in the parking lot when he walked away before I could ask what he meant. I don't call. I don't text. I check into my hotel and spend the first 2 days conducting interviews and gathering research, throwing myself into the work with the kind of focused intensity that's supposed to quiet the voice in my head that keeps whispering his name. On the 3rd evening, I'm standing in the produce section of a grocery store, staring at the kind of pre-packaged salads that constitute dinner when you're living out of a hotel room, when I see him. Just like that. No dramatic music, no slow-motion moment of recognition. Just Grant, standing 10 feet away, holding a bag of apples, and wearing the same worn baseball cap he's had since college. For a second, neither of us moves. We just stand there among the pyramids of fruit and the misting vegetables, 2 people caught in the act of existing in the same space after months of careful avoidance. Then his face breaks into that half-smile I remember from 1,000 other moments, and he says, "Hey, stranger." The hug lasts longer than it should. Long enough for me to remember how he smells like that expensive deodorant and something else, something that might be fabric softener or might just be the particular sin of a life lived in one place long enough to accumulate familiar smells. Long enough for me to feel the solid reality of him, to confirm that he's not just a figment of my overthinking imagination, but an actual person who exists in actual space, buying actual groceries like any other human being. We end up at coffee, then lunch, then wandering through the downtown area talking about everything except why we stopped talking 8 months ago. He tells me about his daughter's soccer team and the promotion he's up for at work. I tell him about the article I'm writing and the city I lived in last month and the way hotel rooms all start to look the same after a while. It feels like slipping back into a comfortable shirt you forgot you owned. Easy and familiar, and somehow more natural than all the careful distance we've been maintaining. When he laughs at something I say, it's the same laugh from the photo booth, bright and unguarded and completely present. As the afternoon stretches toward evening, I start preparing for the goodbye that will return us to our careful silence. Start composing the polite text I'll send tomorrow thanking him for the time and promising to keep in touch in that vague way people do when they don't actually plan to keep in touch. But then he says, "You should come by. It's been too long." I notice the language immediately. Not "we miss you," which would include his wife in the invitation. Not "you should meet Sarah," which would acknowledge the family context that's supposed to define his life now. Just I. Just the singular pronoun that creates space for the two of us to exist without the complications of other people's expectations. When I get to his house, the lights are dim and his car is the only one in the driveway. He explains that his wife and daughter are out of town visiting family, says it almost casually, like it's not the reason he felt safe enough to invite me over. Like it's not the reason we can sit in his living room without having to perform the careful choreography of appropriate friendship. We talk until 3 in the morning, about books and movies and the way time feels different when you're not paying attention to it passing, about the places I've been and the life he's built, and the strange feeling that we're both exactly where we're supposed to be and completely lost at the same time. When I finally say I should go, he walks me to the door and stands there for a moment with his hand on the doorframe, looking like he's trying to solve a puzzle he doesn't have all the pieces for. That's when he says it again. "It's just easier with you." The same 4 words from 8 months ago, delivered with the same soft certainty that made them impossible to forget. This time I wait. This time I don't let him walk away before I can ask the question that's been living in my chest like an unfinished song. But he doesn't explain. He just looks at me with something that might be regret or might be relief, and says goodnight like it's the most ordinary word in the world. I extend the assignment by a week, then another. Tell my editor I need more time to gather comprehensive data, that the story is more complex than initially anticipated. She doesn't question it. In her world, thorough reporting is always preferable to rushed deadlines, and I've never missed a submission before. She doesn't need to know that the complexity I'm researching has nothing to do with migration patterns and everything to do with the way Grant's presence makes time feel negotiable. The hotel room becomes a base camp rather than a temporary stop. I learn which coffee shop has the strongest Wi-Fi and which restaurant delivers food that doesn't taste like cardboard. I memorized the route between downtown and Grant's neighborhood, the sequence of traffic lights and turn signals that mark the distance between my temporary life and his permanent one. We don't plan to see each other every day. It just happens. He texts about a movie he thinks I'd like, and suddenly we're sitting in the back row of a nearly empty theater watching something foreign and subtitled while sharing a container of overpriced popcorn. I mention wanting to find a good bookstore, and he knows one that stays open late, the kind of place where you can lose hours wandering between sections that smell like old paper and possibility. We fall back into rhythms that feel like muscle memory. Late night drives through neighborhoods that blur together in the darkness, windows down, music from college playing low on the stereo. The same songs that used to soundtrack our aimless adventures when time felt infinite and the future was something that happened to other people. Now they feel like archaeological evidence of who we used to be before life taught us to want different things. One evening, we end up back at his house after dinner at a place that serves the kind of comfort food designed to make you nostalgic for a childhood you might not have actually had. His wife and daughter are still away, won't be back for another week, and the house feels like a stage set waiting for actors who won't appear for the performance. We settle into his garage, a space that feels more like him than the carefully decorated living room with its family photos and throw pillows arranged just so. Here, surrounded by tools he probably doesn't use in boxes of seasonal decorations, the air smells like motor oil and possibility. He pulls out a beer for each of us, and we sit on the concrete floor with our backs against his workbench, talking about nothing important while the overhead light casts everything in amber. That's when he disappears for a few minutes and returns with a folder I recognize from college. Manila, worn soft at the edges, stuffed with papers that look like they've been handled more than they should be. He pulls out a sheaf of pages held together with a paperclip that's gone rusty with age. "Remember this?" he asks, and hands me the story he wrote senior year for his one and only creative writing elective. The one he submitted for the campus literary magazine and never heard back about. The one he said was just an experiment, just him trying something different from the business reports and market analyses that filled most of his notebooks. I remember it perfectly. Two boys in a small town, suffocating under the weight of other people's expectations, who steal a car one summer night and drive until they run out of gas somewhere in the middle of Nevada. It's about freedom and friendship and the kind of desperate love that doesn't know how to name itself. It's about choosing each other over safety, over the lives they're supposed to want. I told him it was beautiful when he first showed it to me. Asked if it was autobiographical. He laughed it off, said it was just fiction, just imagination, just the kind of story you write when you're 21 and think you understand anything about anything. Now, 15 years later, I read it again while he watches my face for reactions I'm not sure I know how to hide. The prose is better than I remembered, more confident, more honest about the way desire can feel like drowning and salvation at the same time. But it's the details that undo me. The way one character always drives because the other gets carsick on winding roads. The inside joke about gas station coffee that only makes sense if you know about our sophomore year road trip. The description of watching someone sleep in the passenger seat and feeling like you're guarding something precious. "You told me it wasn't about us," I say when I finish reading. He looks down at his beer, picks at the label with his thumbnail. I lied. The words hang in the air between us like a confession that's been waiting 15 years to be spoken. I want to ask why he lied, why he needed me to believe it was fiction when the truth was so much more interesting. But the question feels too large for this moment, too heavy for the fragile thing we're building in the space between what we say and what we mean. We sit in the dim light, neither of us moving to break the spell that admitting the truth has cast. Finally, Grant speaks again, so quietly I have to lean closer to hear him. "I don't know what I'm doing. I just know when you're here, I don't feel like I'm pretending." I don't ask what he's pretending about. Don't ask if it's the marriage or the mortgage or the whole careful construction of a life that looks right from the outside. Some questions are too dangerous to ask when you're not sure you're ready for the answers. Instead, I just stay close enough to hear him breathing. Close enough that when his hand moves across the concrete floor and brushes against mine, neither of us pulls away. We just sit there, connected by the accidental touch and the weight of everything we've never said, while the garage light flickers overhead and time moves around us like water. The drinking starts innocently enough. A second beer turns into a third, Then Grant produces a bottle of whiskey that's been sitting on a shelf in his garage since some long-forgotten birthday or promotion. The kind of expensive stuff people give you when they want to mark an occasion but don't know you well enough to know what you actually want. We're still sitting on the concrete floor, still close enough that our shoulders brush when one of us shifts position. The story he wrote in college lies between us like evidence of a crime neither of us is ready to confess to committing. The amber light overhead makes everything feel soft around the edges, makes the careful boundaries we've spent years maintaining seem arbitrary and negotiable. I'm not usually much of a drinker. Years of moving from place to place taught me that alcohol and emotional honesty don't mix well when you're trying to maintain the kind of careful distance that keeps you safe. But tonight feels different. Tonight feels like the kind of evening where safety is less important than truth, where the whiskey burns just enough to make the words I've been carrying feel lighter. That's when I tell him about the road trip. It was junior year, spring break, and everyone else had gone home to their families or to beaches that promised sunburn and regret in equal measure. We decided to drive to nowhere in particular, just point the car west and see what happened. Grant had been working too hard, stressed about internship applications and graduation requirements, and all the adult responsibilities that were creeping closer every day. I suggested we disappear for a week, and he said yes before I'd even finished asking. We drove for hours, taking turns behind the wheel, stopping at diners with names like Sunrise Cafe and Lucky's Place where the coffee was strong and the pie was homemade. Somewhere outside of Kansas, Grant started getting carsick from the winding roads, so I took over driving permanently while he navigated from the passenger seat with an atlas that was already 5 years out of date. On the third day, exhausted from driving and giddy from too much gas station coffee, we pulled over at a rest stop to stretch our legs and figure out where we were going to sleep. Grant climbed back into the passenger seat while I studied the map, trying to find the closest town with a motel that wouldn't ask too many questions about why two college boys were sharing a room. When I looked over at him, he was asleep, head tilted against the window, mouth slightly open, one hand resting on his thigh and the other curled against his chest. The late afternoon sun was coming through the windshield at just the right angle to make his hair look golden, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. That's when I knew. I tell Grant now, 20 years later, in his garage with his wife's car parked just outside and family photos hanging on the walls of the house beyond. Watching you sleep in that passenger seat. That's when I realized I wasn't just along for the ride. I was in love with you. The words come out steady and clear, like they've been waiting all this time for the right moment to be spoken. Grant doesn't say anything for a long time, just stares at the bottle in his hands like it might contain answers to questions he's been afraid to ask. When he finally speaks, his voice is so quiet I have to lean closer to hear him. I used to pretend you were just safer, easier to be around. But the truth is, I didn't know how to look at you without wanting more. The admission hangs between us like smoke, visible and intangible at the same time. I feel something in my chest unclench, some tension I've been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it was there. Then why didn't you? I ask, and immediately regret the question because I can see in his face that he's already considered it 1,000 times. He takes a long drink from the bottle before answering. Because I chose the life I thought I was supposed to want. And now it's not just mine to leave. The honesty of it hits me like cold water. Not just the words themselves, but the weight behind them. The years of careful construction that would have to be dismantled if he chose differently. The mortgage and the marriage and the little girl who calls him daddy and trusts him to be the kind of man who keeps his promises. Something breaks then, but not in the dramatic way you might expect. Instead, the tension that's been building between us for weeks, for years, for decades, simply exhales itself into something softer. Grant leans sideways until his shoulder presses against mine, until his head comes to rest in the space between my neck and my collarbone. His breathing is shaky, like he's trying not to cry, and I can feel the warmth of him through both our shirts. We stay like that for what feels like hours, not moving, not speaking, just existing in the tender space between admission and action. Eventually, he gets up without explanation and disappears into the house. I follow after a few minutes, finding him in the kitchen, standing motionless in front of the refrigerator. There's a photo held up by a magnet shaped like a butterfly. His wife and daughter at some amusement park, both of them laughing at something just outside the frame. Normal family happiness captured in 4 by 6 inches. He's staring at it like it's a puzzle he's trying to solve, like the answer to everything is hidden somewhere in their faces. You should go, he says quietly, not turning around. I want to argue. Want to point out that we're closer to honesty than we've ever been. That walking away now feels like the kind of waste that leaves permanent scars. But looking at him standing there, caught between the life he built and the life he might have chosen, I understand that some moments can't be forced. So I go, but not before touching his shoulder once, briefly, just enough to let him know that leaving doesn't mean disappearing. I leave the next morning without saying goodbye. Check out of the hotel while the sun is still painting everything in shades of regret and possibility. Drive toward the interstate with the radio off and my phone turned face down on the passenger seat. The article about suburban migration gets filed 2 days later from a coffee shop in Denver, 1,500 words about demographic shifts and housing markets that feel like they were written by someone else entirely. For 3 months, I don't write. Don't call. Don't send the kind of casual text that would let him know I'm thinking about him without having to admit how much space those thoughts occupy in my daily existence. Instead, I throw myself into work with the kind of desperate focus that people mistake for ambition when it's really just elaborate avoidance. I take assignments in places that require passport stamps and vaccination records. Write about water rights disputes in rural Guatemala and political corruption in small European capitals. Stories that demand complete attention, that leave no room for the kind of distracted longing that have been making my sentences feel hollow and my deadlines feel arbitrary. But geography has never been a reliable cure for memory. Every hotel room starts to feel like the one where I sat staring at Grant's college story, trying to decode the years of careful silence that had led us to that moment in his garage. Every airplane window becomes a frame for remembering the way he looked at that family photo, caught between the life he'd built and the one he'd never allowed himself to imagine. The worst part is how ordinary it all feels. How easy it is to pretend that nothing happened, that we're just two old friends who lost touch the way people do when life gets complicated. I tell myself that some things are better left unfinished, that the careful distance we've maintained for years was probably the kindest choice for everyone involved. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, while I'm sitting in a hotel room in Portland trying to write about salmon migration patterns, there's a knock on my door. The delivery driver hands me a package with no return address, just my name written in handwriting I recognize before I fully process what I'm seeing. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that smells faintly like the garage where we'd sat drinking whiskey and admitting things we'd spent decades avoiding, is the photo strip from that booth 20 years ago. But it's what the photos are taped to that makes my hands shake as I hold them. A postcard from some roadside attraction we must have stopped at during that spring break trip. The kind of kitschy souvenir that teenagers buy to prove they were somewhere, then forget about until they find it years later in boxes of college memorabilia. On the back, in Grant's careful handwriting, a single sentence, "I still think about that trip every day." I stare at those words until they blur, until the hotel room around me feels less substantial than the memory of driving through Kansas with an out-of-date atlas and no particular destination in mind. Until I can almost hear the sound of Grant's breathing from the passenger seat, the rhythm that told me he was asleep and safe and trusting me to get us wherever we were going. A week later, he calls. Not a text, which would allow for the kind of careful consideration that leads to overthinking and deleted drafts. Just his voice on the other end of the line, saying my name like a question he's not sure he knows how to ask. "Can we meet?" he says. "I know it's complicated. I know I don't have the right to ask, but I need to see you." 3 days later, I'm sitting in my rental car in the parking lot where we used to come as teenagers to watch thunderstorms roll across the valley. The same spot where we'd park for hours, sharing gas station snacks and arguing about music while lightning illuminated the sky in brief, electric moments that made everything feel temporary and eternal at the same time. Grant arrives exactly when he said he would, parks next to me, and climbs into my passenger seat without ceremony. For a moment, we just sit there in the familiar configuration, him on the right, me on the left, the space between us charged with 20 years of careful navigation. He speaks slowly, like he's been rehearsing the words, but isn't sure they'll come out right. "I can't offer you the life you deserve. I don't even know what I'm doing anymore." The silence that follows feels heavy with all the things he's not saying, All the complications that make simple honesty feel like a luxury neither of us can afford. But I had to see you again, he continues, and his voice breaks slightly on the word again, like it contains all the times he thought about calling and didn't, all the moments when missing me felt like a physical ache. Because even now, it's still easier with you. There it is again, those 4 words that started everything, that brought me back to this place where time feels negotiable and the future feels like something we might actually have a say in shaping. This time, I don't ask what he means. Don't push for the kind of clarity that might shatter whatever fragile thing we're building in the space between admission and action. Instead, I reach across the center console and take his hand. Months later, I'm standing at a payphone outside a diner in Nevada, the kind of place where the coffee is always fresh and the pie is always yesterday's, where travelers stop to fuel up before disappearing back into the vastness that stretches between one nowhere and another. The receiver is warm against my ear, heated by the desert sun that turns everything into variations of gold and amber. The conversation lasts 23 minutes. I know because I'm feeding quarters into the machine every few minutes, the metallic clink marking time in a way that feels both urgent and eternal. I don't say much, mostly just listen to Grant's voice traveling across hundreds of miles of highway and telephone wire, carrying news and updates, and the small daily details that make up a life. He tells me about his daughter's school play, how she forgot her lines halfway through but improvised something that made the whole audience laugh. About the promotion he finally got, the one that means longer hours but also means he can start thinking about college funds and family vacations to places that require passports. About the way autumn looks in his neighborhood, the maple trees turning colors that remind him of the road trip postcards we used to collect. I don't hear everything he says. The connection isn't perfect, and there are moments when his voice cuts out, replaced by the hollow static that reminds you how far sound has to travel to reach you. But I hear enough. Enough to know that he sounds different, lighter somehow, like he's been carrying something heavy for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to set it down. When he asks about my work, I tell him about the article I'm writing about small towns that exist solely because of interstate highway intersections. Places that were never meant to be destinations, just waypoints for people traveling between more important else's. It's research that requires a lot of driving, a lot of conversations with people who've chosen to build lives in the spaces between other people's journeys. I don't tell him that I chose this assignment because it gives me an excuse to be unreachable, to exist in the kind of liminal space where phone calls have to be planned and letters arrive weeks after they're sent. Some truths are easier to carry when you're moving. Near the end of the conversation, there's a pause that stretches long enough for me to hear the desert wind and the distant hum of 18-wheelers on the interstate. Then Grant says my name, just once, soft and careful like he's testing the weight of it. I'm still figuring this out, he says, but I wanted you to know that I'm figuring it out. The dial tone comes a few minutes later, after we've said goodbye in the awkward way people do when they're not sure when they'll talk again, but know that they will. I hang up the receiver and walk back to my rental car, carrying the sound of his voice like a warmth in my chest. The motel room is exactly what you'd expect from a place that charges $39 a night and doesn't ask questions about how long you're planning to stay. Single bed with a comforter that's seen better decades, air conditioning unit that sounds like it's fighting a losing battle against the desert heat, television that gets 3 channels if you hold the antenna just right. But it's clean, and it's quiet, and the duffel bag sits at the foot of the bed like an old friend who doesn't need conversation to feel welcome. Inside, between the navy blue hoodie and the stick of expensive deodorant, there's something new. An envelope that arrived at my hotel in Denver 2 weeks ago, forwarded through the network of temporary addresses that keeps my mail moving even when I don't know where I'll be sleeping next month. The letter is handwritten on stationery that looks like it came from a hotel gift shop somewhere, the kind of cream-colored paper that makes even grocery lists look important. Grant's handwriting fills both sides, careful and deliberate like he took time to think about each word before committing it to paper. Most of it is about ordinary things. The weather, a book he thinks I'd like, a song that came on the radio and reminded him of college. But it's the ending that I've read so many times the paper is starting to wear soft at the fold lines. I don't know what this is. I just know I feel most like myself when you're near. I don't know if that's love, but it's something, and I'm not pretending anymore. I fold the letter carefully, the way you handle things that might be fragile, and place it in the drawer beside the bed. Not hiding it, just keeping it safe in the way you keep things that matter more than they probably should. Tomorrow I'll drive to the next town, and the one after that, following the thread of stories that need telling and the highways that connect them. There's no particular destination in mind, no deadline that can't be negotiated, no plan beyond the kind of forward motion that feels like the only honest response to questions that don't have clear answers. But tonight I lie in this motel bed listening to the desert wind and thinking about phone calls and letters and the way some connections refuse to be defined by geography or circumstance or the careful categories people use to make sense of love. Outside, the highway stretches toward horizons that disappear into darkness, carrying travelers toward whatever version of home they're brave enough to claim. And somewhere, in a house with a mortgage and family photos and the ordinary complications of a settled life, Grant is probably lying in his own bed, staring at his own ceiling, carrying his own version of this same quiet certainty. We don't know what this is, but it's something. And for now, something feels like enough.